and welcome to our second Food Day webinar. Thanks for joining us. My name is Catherine Castleman, and I'm one of the project coordinators for Food Day. Today we're going to hear from Mike Jacobson, who's the Executive Director of CSPI, and from Dr. Robert Lawrence at the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins University, and from Dr. Keeve Nachman, Director of the Farming for the Future program at the Center for a Livable Future. I'm just going to take a few moments now to describe how the webinar is going to work. If we don't see your question or get to your comment question, you can email us at foodday@cspinet.org, and I'll show that slide with the email address a little later on. You'll see on the dashboard that appears on your screen that there's an area where you can type in questions. If you have questions or comments during the webinar, please type them there, and I'll read them out during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and I'll direct them to a panelist to answer. So please indicate your name and where you're from when you type in your question, and we'll try to get to it at the end. This webinar session is being recorded, so you and your colleagues can look back at it later, and we'll send a link to that recording in a follow-up email within a few days after the webinar is over. So first, I'm going to turn things over to Michael Jacobson of CSPI to give us some information about Food Day and the progress of our campaign.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome to everybody who's on the webinar, particularly our two guests. As most of you know, I think, Food Day is October 24th, and it's going to be kind of like Earth Day, with events occurring all over the country in big cities, small towns, churches, colleges, the works, to highlight what's great about America's bountiful food supply and where are some of the problems and what can we do about those problems. We're focusing especially on 5 key areas. A couple related to diet and health, reducing diet-related disease that is due to foods high in salt, saturated fat, sugar, too little fruits and vegetables. We're going to support sustainable agriculture and urge the limitation of subsidies that go to big farms and agribusiness. We're concerned about the marketing of junk foods to kids. That's where it all starts, in childhood. We want to highlight problems with hunger, the pockets of hunger that persist, and work towards expunging food deserts, those areas in inner cities and out in rural areas where people just don't have access to healthy foods. And feature of today's webinar has to do with factory farms, what the impact is of factory farms on the environment, on animal welfare, and on public health. And to guide us through that, we're lucky to have 2 real experts on the issue. First is Dr. Robert Lawrence. I first encountered Dr. Lawrence when I was writing a book 5 years ago called 6 Arguments for a Greener Diet. It was running to about 300 pages. And then I read an article that Dr. Lawrence wrote, co-authored in Science magazine, that condensed everything into about 6 pages, looking at the health, environmental, and animal welfare aspects of modern agriculture, so-called contemporary agriculture. Dr. Lawrence is the Center for a Livable Future professor and also a professor of environmental health sciences, health policy, and international health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And he's a professor of medicine at the Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Lawrence trained, got his MD at the Harvard Medical School, and then trained in internal medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital. And he subsequently served for 3 years as an epidemic intelligence service officer at the Centers for Disease Control. In 1996, Dr. Lawrence became the founding director of the Center for a Livable Future at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And the center is an interdisciplinary group of faculty and staff that focuses on equity, health, and the Earth's resources. It's really a remarkable program that he's pulled together. And somebody else at the center that we'll be hearing from shortly is Keev Nachman, who's director of the Farming for the Future program at the Center for a Livable Future. And he's going to be talking especially about the issue of antibiotic resistance that may result on factory farms. So, Dr. Lawrence, take it away.
Thank you very much, Michael and Catherine. It's a pleasure to be with you on this first webinar that we've done for Food Day. We hope there will be opportunities to do more as the October 24th date arrives. And it really is a terrific opportunity to bring together all the stakeholders to address these 5 key areas that you heard Michael describe. I'm going to start off with a quote from Wendell Berry, who recently received a Medal of Honor from President Obama. Wendell is a farmer, a philosopher, a poet, and a writer in Kentucky. And he said that there's no connection between food and health. That people are fed by a food industry which pays no attention to health and are healed by a health industry that pays no attention to food. And it seems to me that Food Day is a great opportunity to address the fact that indeed, if we are feeding junk food to our children, if we're eroding soil, air, and water quality through failure to protect the environment, we're not going to have a sustainable source of healthy, nutritious food into the future, address the gaps in food security and the food deserts that Michael mentioned in his opening. One of the things that is so striking about today's agriculture, and by that I mean the agriculture that has developed over the last 60 years, more or less with the end of World War II to the present time, is that it has become almost unrecognizable to those farmers who were providing food for all of us in the early part of the 20th century. It has become highly specified. This chart shows the number of commodities that were raised per farm back in the 1900s and then progressing through the 20th century. And so a typical farm, 1900, would have been a couple of hundred acres. It would have probably had a small collection of animals, maybe a small dairy herd of 20 to 30 animals, perhaps half a dozen or a dozen pigs, chickens in the farmyard. And then commercial commodities that were actually sold at market might include hay, wheat, corn, alfalfa, fruits and vegetables. Progressively, farms have become more concentrated and now only 1.1 commodities per farm. To put this in perspective with regard to Iowa, the sort of the heart of our agricultural system and getting a lot of attention now with the build-up to next year's presidential election. About 25 years ago, there were 32 different commercially viable commodities being produced in Iowa, meaning that they were exported out of state for sale or they were had a cash value within state. Today, we are down essentially to 4. Corn, soybeans, hogs, and beef cattle. So the concentration has its consequences with regard to biodiversity and resilience in the system. It also has its consequences for requiring further and further shipment of diverse foods in order to satisfy a full, complete menu for the American family. The major consequence of industrialization of the U.S. agriculture system, however, has been the dramatic increase in the amount of meat consumed by Americans. In this graph, the figures to the left need to be multiplied by 1,000. So the lower left number is 10 billion pounds of meat consumed or produced in the United States. In 1960, it was about 35 billion pounds, and now it's up over 90 billion pounds. And they also graphically related, of course, to the number of food animals that are actually produced in the United States. So it shows the dramatic increase in the green portion representing broilers. Beef and veal actually remain rather static throughout this period, as does the amount of pork production. Although the poultry industry has grown most sharply during the last 50 or 60 years, is also the industry that has had the greatest amount of concentration. This slide requires a little bit of explanation. The top one, 1949, actually captures the number of poultry processing plants. Each dot on the map of the United States represents a plant capable of processing 50,000 or more broilers per year. And you see that the industry was fairly well distributed throughout the United States, with a heavy concentration in the farm belt running from the Dakotas down into Texas. 2000, each dot now represents the annual production of 1 million or more chickens, rather than representing the processing plant. All of the major processing plants now are located where the chickens are being produced, so they have shifted to the southeast. And you see that in the Susquehanna Valley of Pennsylvania, and then down into the eastern shore of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, into Georgia, northern part of Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, we have this incredible concentration of poultry production. This graph represents in a little clearer way what has been shown in the previous 3 slides. And you'll notice the lines at the bottom, the slight increase in turkey production, and the salmon-colored line. The purple pork line is fairly flat, as is the beef line. And it's the poultry line, the yellow broiler line, that continues to climb and then has plateaued in the last few years. And there's actually some indication that chicken consumption related to the recession, related to the price of corn for chicken feed, and related therefore to the price of chicken at the grocery store, chicken consumption is slightly declining in the last year or two. But the parallel lines of the broiler yellow line and then the total orange line at the top, you can see that all of the increase in meat consumption since 1960 has really been because of the dramatic increase in the amount of broilers that we're consuming. When we look at our relative meat consumption, because of this growth of production, we see that on average the typical American is consuming about 220 pounds per person per year, compared to other high-income or industrialized countries about 155 pounds per person. The American Heart Association actually recommends limiting our total consumption to about 125 pounds per year, and you see the low income and the lower middle income or developing countries average just over 50 pounds per year. It's worth pointing out that in the developing countries there's great variation in the amount of meat consumed, depending on whether you're a member of the urban elite of a developing country or whether you're a low income person living on $1 or $2 a day, in which case you very have very, very little meat in your diet. The connection then between our contemporary American diet, the focus of Food Day, to get us thinking more clearly about the links between diet and health, shows that the typical American meal is high in saturated fats and in sugars, with that cream on the baked potato and the large piece of steak and relatively small portion of vegetables, compared to the lower left low-fat meal, pasta, lots of vegetables, higher in grains and beans, higher in fiber, and higher in the nutrients that are part of fruits and vegetables. To sort of summarize now the overall impact of what we're talking about with regard to the way in which industrialization of food animal production has been driving the shape and the substance of the American diet. This graph shows, or this table shows, that 1 million broilers are killed and consumed per hour, 24/7, 52 weeks a year in the United States. We also raise, kill, and consume 113 or 114 million hogs, about 33 million head of cattle, 2.5 million sheep and lambs, and a significant number, 245 million turkeys. And that number probably will rise slowly, depending, again, on food prices, especially the price of corn, a major constituent of animal feed. One of the interventions that we have had for the past 9 years now is a collaboration with the Healthy Mondays campaign in New York City, which is a not-for-profit organization, and the Meatless Monday portion of that. You can get more details at meatlessmonday.com. We provided support and continue to provide scientific support for the Meatless Monday campaign, which is now sort of going viral across the United States. A recent poll showed that about 50% of Americans have heard of the Meatless Monday campaign, and somewhere between 20 and 25% of Americans claim that they have actually begun to restrict their consumption of meat on Mondays. The point of this is just to lower that tremendous impact of saturated fat in the American diet. In the year 2000, the then Surgeon General David Satcher laid out the Healthy People 2010 objectives for the nation. And in it, he called for a 15% reduction of saturated fat in the American diet. And all of us who have tried to pay attention to what we're eating knows how difficult it would be 21 times a week to decide how to reduce what's on your plate by 15% of saturated fat. So the Meatless Monday campaign captures 1 day a week, which is about 15% of the week, and just says if you abstain from meat and saturated fat, you will reach the Surgeon General's goals for the nation for a healthier diet. There are many different health impacts of industrial food production methods. We've talked thus far about the disproportionate amount of meat in our diet and the loss of biodiversity and the concentration of commodities on the nation's farms. But there are also impacts mediated through the environment, through contamination of the soil, water, and air, through the tremendous dependence we now have on chemicals, hormones, and other pesticides in our food supply, some of which end up functioning as endocrine disruptors, creating additional health hazards for the American population. The antibiotics and antibiotic-resistant bacteria problem we'll go into a little bit more detail when Keith Nachman joins us. And then there are things like the contribution to global climate change of industrial food animal production that has about 40% of the energy consumed on our farms today is actually through the use of natural gas to make ammonium fertilizers and the use of petroleum to make the pesticides that are used to control insects. Another enormous contribution to climate change is the sheer volume of animals being raised. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the WHO estimated 4 years ago in its report the growing shadow of animal husbandry, or the long shadow of animal husbandry, that as much as 18 or 19% of greenhouse gases were contributed to by raising meat for human consumption. When you add in everything from land use change, from clearing forests to create more pasture land, to the methane released by animals as they digest cellulose in the grass and so forth. Then finally, I just want to mention the loss of social capital in rural America as farms have gotten larger and more concentrated. The economic support for small towns across rural America has been drying up. We do have to concede that industrial food animal production has had some significant achievements, but with real costs. And unfortunately, these environmental, public health, economic, and social concerns have been externalized. They're not captured in the amount we pay at the grocery store. And the heavy reliance on inputs exacts a heavy cost in pollution and environmental degradation. Dennis Keeney, one of our colleagues at the University of, at Iowa State, the founding director of the Aldo Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and a colleague of his in 2003 observed that our society and the natural environment bear the cost of those unintended consequences in the form of environmental and public health impacts. I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague, Keith Nachman, who has, for the last several years, been directing our Farming for the Future program and is an expert on the significant problem of antibiotic resistance. Keith?
Thanks, Bob. So I'm jumping in from another webinar, and so I'm going to switch gears right now and start off by talking about some of the community health effects associated with swine concentrating animal feeding operations. So there have been a number of epidemiologic investigations that have looked at communities that live in close proximity to swine production sites. And those studies have, based on that proximity, determined that in those persons, they experience higher rates of a variety of respiratory problems, often doctor-diagnosed asthma, as well as some self-limiting conditions like nausea, diarrhea, headaches, and plugged ears. Among those folks, there's a general increase in reports of irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat, and numerous mental health outcomes that are a little more challenging to quantify using standard epidemiologic methods, but those include mood swings, depression, anxiety, anger, fatigue, and confusion. And the majority of these studies have demonstrated that you'll see actually a gradient of these outcomes as you move further away from the animal production sites. You see the frequency of reports of these outcomes decreasing. So the evidence base continues to expand over time, but it is becoming increasingly clear that these operations and exposures to some of the air pollutants, some of the water pollutants, are particularly responsible for them. And what these images here show you, these are actually from swine and dairy CAFO. The top is swine, the second is a dairy. These are the spreading of swine and dairy waste on agricultural fields. And in the first figure, you can see that the sprayers are actually reaching the backs of people's backyards. And I've heard reports anecdotally that some of the sprayers are actually capable and high enough powered that the waste will spray on the back of folks' homes. So there are very clearly opportunities for people to breathe contaminants, to come into dermal contact with contaminants that are embedded in the waste of the manure from these animal production sites. And the bottom figure is the spraying of swine waste. The design of this particular piece of equipment was to spread water on fields, but it's been modified to effectively spray swine waste as an agricultural fertilizer. And you can see in the background there are houses nearby, so there are certainly opportunities. In addition to being sited near a production facility, there are opportunities living near farmland where you could be exposed to waste from those production facilities. Okay. So I think I heard Bob, as I was coming in, mention some of the externalities associated with producing animals for food or producing crops for food. But to drill down a little more, these are the costs that are not factored in to what you pay in the grocery store when you buy a package of pork or a package of chicken. But these costs are borne by society as a whole. And there are numerous externalities, both health and economic and ecologic. The first is the depletion of natural resources, and there is a spectrum of types of depletion of these resources. An example would be the resources required to produce enough food to raise a food animal. Depending on the type of food animal, by weight, there's a ratio. I say for chickens it's 2 to 1. For beef cattle, I think it's 9 to 1. Per pound of animal, it takes that many pounds of feed to bring the animal to market weight. And so that certainly has impacts on all of the inputs that are required to produce food, including fossil fuel, water, soil, and certainly can have impacts on biodiversity as well. In addition, the resources that are invested in producing food require the use, or not necessarily require, but often incur the use of numerous pesticides and fertilizers that can pose risks to those who may come into contact as a part of spreading them, but also to those who come into contact with water downstream of where these pesticides and fertilizers are transported via runoff or leaching into groundwater aquifers. So in many cases, folks living in rural areas may rely not on community water systems from a city, but on groundwater, and they may tap into an aquifer that, if it's shallow enough, may be directly impacted by animal waste-borne contaminants, pesticides that may run off from agricultural fields, or contaminants inherent in the fertilizers that are used to raise some of those products. So there's certainly a detrimental impact on those folks. And absolutely, there are economic, social, and health costs to communities. I mentioned before many of the health effects associated with living near an animal production site or living near a field where animal waste is spread as fertilizer, but that doesn't necessarily speak to some of the economic disadvantages those folks incur. It's tough to sell a house that gets sprayed once in a while by animal waste. It's not a really appealing sell if the photo of your house that's used in an advertisement for real estate has a pile of manure in the back, and we've talked with many folks who have that very problem. So once you're stuck in a community where animals are being raised or where a number of new animal production sites have been sited, you're stuck there. And it's likely you don't have a lot of political capital to speak to local folks or state folks that can help you deal with some of your concerns related to exposure, or certainly on the impacts of your property values. And there's a growing body of literature that shows that having a house that's near an animal production site or near a manure spread site is associated with declines in property values and certainly decrements in quality of life. So these are not considered in the cost of the food of the meat that you purchase from the store. So let's do the next slide. Use of chemicals. This is absolutely a critical point both in crop production and in animal production. The most recent count I've seen is over 1,600 chemicals are used in the manufacture of pesticides, and many of them have been tested because they're considered to be inert. And inerts in many cases are chemicals that have historically been called, generally regarded as safe, or grass. And by all accounts of public health folks and toxicologists, many of the methods for evaluating the potential toxicity of those grass chemicals were not developed at the time that they were designated to be grass chemicals. So we really don't know about what many of those chemicals may be. By all best estimates, we have the richest set of data on what the active ingredients in the pesticides are, and frankly, there are still many gaps in our understanding of how those chemicals might act on humans to cause illness and potentially mortality. So worldwide, we're spreading over 6 million tons of pesticides in agricultural fields per year. And clearly being exposed to these pesticides has a variety of human health outcomes that would result from being exposed chronically to low levels over time, especially there are numerous neurological outcomes, respiratory outcomes. But beyond that, we recently did an analysis that shows that the top 100 most used pesticides impact over 18 different organ systems and particular health outcomes. So these things certainly have biological relevance. And that doesn't speak at all to some of the acute poisonings that may occur in pesticide applicators that may have long-term sequelae on a variety of organ systems and in some cases may increase cancer risks. The Environmental Working Group, I believe it's once every year, produces a report, a fantastic report called the Dirty Dozen and Cleanest 12, where they identify the produce items that are the most contaminated based on residue sampling data and the least contaminated based on residue sampling data. And what's interesting to note here is that the most contaminated produce items tend to be the items where you don't peel anything, you eat. There are foods that do not have a peel, or you eat the food as is, whereas the least contaminated tend to be things where you're not eating the surface of that particular food. So that's certainly of note. Produce contamination with microbiological hazards is associated with, it's estimated about 48 million cases of foodborne disease in the U.S. each year. Now that's really the tip of the iceberg because CDC relies on reports, and in many cases foodborne illness is what you'd call self-limiting and doesn't necessarily result in a doctor visit. So CDC makes an attempt to account for the fraction that go unreported, but it's believed in the public health community that may be an underestimate. And it's been determined that foodborne illness associated with produce is really just going up over time. So let's shift gears for a moment and talk about animal waste. I know we've talked about this before. I usually try and animate this slide to walk everyone through it, but I'd like to start by focusing your attention on human waste. So the United States generates about 6.9 million dry tons of human waste per year, that's sewage sludge, and we apply about 3.9 million dry tons of it, or a little over half of it, to agricultural fields each year. Now on the other hand, for animals produce 287 million dry tons of waste per year. That's about a dry ton per U.S. citizen, which is kind of overwhelming. And in comparison to what we do with biosolids, we apply almost all of it to land. And one of the key differences between the two types of waste is that in order to apply human waste or sewage sludge to land, we have to treat the heck out of it to eliminate microbial pathogens, or to attempt to eliminate microbial pathogens, whereas with animal waste, there are no requirements on treatment. In some cases, it's composted, which has been demonstrated to be an inadequate method of treating animal waste, but that's the best you're going to get, and composting doesn't do anything for certain wasteborne contaminants that can then become available for exposure when people come into contact with animal waste. So animal waste is absolutely an issue. So what's in it? I mentioned that there are a number of microbiological hazards that may be addressed in the treatment of human waste, but again, in animal waste, not at all. There are bacteria, many of which are resistant to antibiotics, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are also other microbiological hazards like protozoa and viruses with varying survival times in waste. There's animal dander, and there's emerging literature that shows dander from a variety of types of animals may elicit allergic responses in humans and may exacerbate asthma. There are a variety of pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, antimicrobials, and in certain types of animals, hormones. There are heavy metals such as arsenic. There are also heavy metal contaminants that end up in waste as a result of the use of mineral mixes that are added that also carry contaminants. So, for example, in the production of brass, some of the waste from that production is added because it is considered to be mineral rich. And along with the minerals from that waste process also are included cadmium, chromium, and some other contaminants such as dioxins as well that make their way into the animal food supply, which then end up in animal waste when they're not taken up into animal tissue. And lastly, and this is sadly what seems to get the most attention with regard to animal waste, is the nutrient content. Animal waste is very high in nitrogen and phosphorus. In this figure here, the top picture is a picture of a swine industrial food animal production site. And you'll see the big square in the center is what we like to call a waste lagoon. So that's liquid swine waste. So the way waste is managed from a swine facility is that the animals poop on the floor, and then the poop is then hosed down out the side of the building and then drained into this large cesspit where it sits until it's sprayed onto field, and it can sit for very long periods of time. And I don't think we have a picture of it in this presentation, but there is a very well-known within the food animal production world event where Hurricane Floyd caused flooding in the Neuse River, and along the Neuse River there are numerous animal production sites and swine CAFOs with these waste lagoons, and the hurricane caused a number of them to rupture, spreading the animal waste all around, and also spreading around carcasses of dead pigs that were killed during the hurricane. So there are certainly opportunities for this waste to mobilize into the environment where people can come into contact with many of these contaminants. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about antibiotics. Antibiotics are used in food animal production in most cases not for therapy, so not to treat an existing condition, but for the purpose of growth promotion and feed conversion. So they're intended to make animals grow faster and make more use of the feed that they're being fed. This is a figure that depicts some data that was put together by the Union of Concerned Scientists and Chuck Benbrook that used some publicly available data on animal drug approvals and on the number of animals being produced in the U.S. to estimate the antibiotic consumption in the animal production sector per year. And what you have on the right is the estimate of human use of antibiotics for the entire U.S. And you'll see that we've shown in this particular figure 2 states whose use of antibiotics or consumption of antibiotics just in the animal agriculture sector overwhelm what we use in humans. And again, this is just a selection of states. So I think the message here is that we've for a long time estimated that the use of antibiotics in animal ag are really responsible for the overwhelming share of antibiotic consumption domestically. Now, very recently, some data were released by the FDA for the first time as a result of the Animal Drug User Fee Act that allowed some folks here actually at CLF to calculate the fraction of antibiotics that are consumed in animal agriculture, and it was determined that nearly 80% of antibiotics used in the United States are used non-therapeutically in animals. And more recently, Louise Slaughter's office was able to get an estimate from the FDA as to what fraction of those antibiotics are administered through feed, and it turns out that a very large fraction are administered through feed rather than through mechanisms that are a little more targeted towards a single animal like injection or direct oral administration. And we just published a paper earlier this year that lays out a rationale for why feeding animals antibiotics through feed is a really poor quality way to ensure a predictable dose of antibiotics in animals, or a uniform dose of antibiotics in animals, and may lead to increased risks with regard to the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So let's talk a little bit more about antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And I might jump ahead to another figure, this one, and then I'll come back to the last one. So let me explain what antibiotic resistance is. So this is a pool of bacteria, and the circle that's colored a light green is a bacterium that is resistant to a particular antibiotic. So when you add that antibiotic through feed in the lower dose, what happens is that you end up killing off all of the bacteria that are susceptible to that antibiotic and leaving the one that's resistant. And what happens is that that bacterium uses the microbial ecosystem resources to reproduce, and what you're left with is a pool of resistant bacteria. So that's something that we call resistant selection or selective pressure through application of low-dose non-therapeutic antibiotics. So I wanted to jump back now to the origins and perpetuation of resistance. So what I just showed you, again, was natural selection for bacteria that are resistant. But there are a number of mechanisms that also contribute to the development and dissemination of antibiotic resistance. There's also the sharing of resistance genes, which I'll show you in a moment. There's something called mutagenesis, which is the mutation within the bacterial DNA that leads to new mechanisms of resistance. And there's also the concept of the reservoir of resistance, which speaks a little bit to the sharing of resistance genes in that there are genes that confer resistance to antibiotics that are within the microbiome that can be shared between bacteria. So in many cases, there are bacteria that are called commensal bacteria, or they may not be pathogenic to humans. They may not cause infections in humans, but they can store resistance genes and share them with other bacteria. So these genes that enable bacteria to resist antibiotics can be transferred between bacteria, and those bacteria can spread and share those genes elsewhere. So that's certainly of concern. And one recent finding I wanted to highlight was a paper earlier last year in Nature demonstrated that antibiotic-resistant bacteria in some cases will actually act altruistically and send out chemical signals to surrounding bacteria that enable them to resist bacteria despite not having their own inherent unique resistance mechanisms. So bacteria can actually work together to help survive in the presence of antibiotics. So that is somewhat alarming. So let me go ahead. So this is the slide where we're talking about sharing of genes that confer resistance between bacteria. There are three primary mechanisms that allow for this. The first is transformation, where you have a bacterium that may have ruptured for whatever reason, maybe exposure to an antibiotic, and DNA from that ruptured cell are released and can be picked up as naked DNA by a recipient cell and incorporated into its genetic code, which would then allow that bacterium to become resistant to antibiotics. The second is bacterial transduction, where bacteria may be infected by a phage virus, and that phage would then be released from the cell where it can infect another cell and deliver the DNA into the recipient cell, and that recipient cell would then become resistant. And lastly, there's bacterial conjugation, where a bacterial cell can actually release a cassette or a plasmid of genes that would contain a gene that confers resistance, and that plasmid would be picked up by a recipient cell who could then incorporate the resistance gene into its own DNA and therefore resist or defend itself against antibiotics. So there are many different mechanisms for these bacteria to share genes that allow them to survive in the presence of antibiotics. So let's shift gears now and talk a little bit about conditions promoting resistance in agriculture. So we know how it might happen. Now, what's unique about these production sites that allow bacteria to stay resistant? So first, there's clearly a failure in infection control, and as you can see by these images on the right, there is a large extent of crowding of animals. So they're in contact with one another, they're in contact with their waste, and these facilities are rarely cleaned. In many cases, they're cleaned once every 2 years. There's also a widespread exposure to antibiotics through feed, and through feed that just sits around in the waste that's never cleaned up. They're chronically administered, these antibiotics, again, at doses that are below what you'd expect to kill off bacteria in any effective manner. And as I mentioned before, there's poor control over the delivery of dose via those antibiotics. And also the animals are stressed being in such crowded conditions, and it's been demonstrated that stress induces bacterial shedding. I think that's it. Bob, would you like to add anything?
Thank you very much, Keith. Well, we think this presentation has touched on some of the extraordinary problems confronting our current highly industrialized agriculture system. And it's just these kinds of problems that Food Day will allow us to mobilize stakeholders interested in offering solutions along the lines that Michael mentioned at the beginning of the session. We in particular are concerned about the health impact of the American diet that is not only high in meat, but high in meat that is contaminated, as Keith has pointed out, with an increasing, alarming array of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So at this point, we'll entertain your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to share this information with you today.
Great, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation, and I know I learned a lot. So now we're going to go to a couple of questions. I'll I'll take the screen back here. Okay, so at this point, we have a couple of questions, and I'll read those out. If you have any questions about the presentation at this time, you can type them into the dashboard on your screen, and we'll have Mike or Dr. Lawrence or Dr. Nachman address those questions. So I'll start with a couple that we have here. We have a question from Brittany Jurgemeyer, who says, a study done by Iowa State University professor Dr. Steve Sapp showed that in Iowa communities favored larger hog facilities, and they were better off if they had a facility in their area. How does that relate to the loss of social capital in rural communities that you talked about?
Well, when I visited Iowa a couple of years ago, I met with a group called Progressive Farmers of Iowa, over 1,000 now, who are trying to restore sustainable methods of food animal production. What happens with these very large facilities is that the farmer contracts with a corporation, Smithfield Farms or Purity Foods, one of the large integrators, and these corporations are vertically integrated. They present the farmer with a contract for which the farmer has no negotiating. It's a take it or leave it. And then the integrator, whether it's a swine integrator or a poultry integrator, provides the young animals, provides the feed without the farmer having any knowledge about what's in the feed, and leaves the farmer with the waste and with the dead animals, and takes the live animals that are at market weight off to the slaughter facility, which is also owned by the integrator. The capital and the investment and the profits don't stay in that Iowa community. In fact, Smithfield has its corporate headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, and the owner of this family-controlled operation lives in Manhattan, New York City. So if you drive anywhere north of Ames and you look at the towns in rural Iowa, you will go through towns where half of the stores are boarded up, where the population is less than half of what it was 20 years ago, and the major assessment of the impact on the quality of rural life and rural capital was done by the Rural Life Commission of the Catholic Church under the leadership of Brother David Andrews, who worked in Iowa for over 11 years documenting the impact. For any given farmer who has a contract with an integrator, that farmer may indeed be enjoying some profitability for his or her own operation. But the money doesn't stay in the community. It doesn't help the local feed grain operator or the local equipment salesperson and so on.
Bob, this is Mike. You've talked about such a wide range of problems, energy because of fertilizer and production and shipping, pesticide contamination of waterways getting into the food affecting workers, resource depletion in terms of soil erosion and water aquifer depletion, and others. How much of that of those problems could organic farming solve?
Well, organic farmer, what we're beginning to use, Mike, as a term that captures what agriculture needs to evolve into is ecologic agriculture. When Aldo Leopold wrote so eloquently about a land ethic, he meant the harmonization of a balance of inputs and outputs, of raising crops in a way that actually strengthened soil quality rather than eroded it, reliance on natural fertilizers from a number of animals per acre that actually was in balance with the nutrient needs of the pasture land and so forth. There has been a lot of controversy, mainly driven by industrial agriculture, that so-called ecologic agriculture or organic farming would not be able to feed the world's people. I have a couple of comments about that. First of all, industrialized agriculture is not feeding the world's people. There are 1 billion malnourished people in the world today. Another billion or 1.5 billion that are overnourished, threatening their lives with the risk of type 2 diabetes because of the obesity epidemic. But the real sustainable part of it comes from the fact that we now are using inputs that are derived from non-renewable resources. And until we can restore the ecosystem balance that will allow us to use fewer of the fertilizers and pesticides that are derived from fossil fuels, that will allow us to use crop rotation techniques that were working extremely well 60 or 70 years ago before current farm policy was instituted, to restore nitrogen by having nitrogen-fixing crops rotated with nitrogen-depleting crops, as well as integrated pest management where you rotated corn and then soybeans and then alfalfa and then perhaps pasture for a year to raise hay. Now we grow corn in the same soil year after year after year, and we end up with the corn rootworm nematode problem that requires a pesticide to kill off the nematodes in order to allow the corn to grow. So at many, many different places, the organic agriculture movement or the ecologic agriculture movement is demonstrating its capacity to produce the same yield, in some places even greater yield per acre, using a combination of more advanced plant breeding and plant cultivation techniques. We've learned a lot of lessons over the last 60 years. It's not as though we're trying to turn the clock back to 1930s style agriculture. We're just trying to wean ourselves from this highly chemically dependent agriculture system we have today.
And we have a lot more questions, so I'm just going to try to touch on a few before we have to end at 2. But several people, including Don Moncrief, have asked about how we can find more information about smaller, more humane slaughter plants and the number of alternative slaughter processes versus the industrialized versions. And a couple of other people have asked, you know, our small farm, what are ways we can get involved and make an impact on this issue? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yes, we collaborate with a group called the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. It has farmers from across the country participating, and the acronym is SRAP. And one of the recent SRAP activities in the last few years has been the development of portable slaughter facilities using essentially a large trailer from a tractor-trailer truck, outfitted with all of the necessary equipment, and that mobile small slaughter facility can go on a farmer's land and slaughter you know, several hundred birds in the morning and then shift over and slaughter 20 hogs in the afternoon. One of the real problems that we've had, it's particularly acute in a state like North Carolina, is that the vertically integrated corporations such as Smithfield, they also then develop a monopsony, meaning that they control all of the slaughter facilities in the state. So if you're a traditional, ecologically oriented swine producer and want to have 60 or 70 swine, pasture-grown, living in hoop houses rather than confined to these factory barns, you can't get those swine slaughtered in the state of North Carolina. You have to drive hundreds of miles. So the SRAP project is specifically designed to make it possible for the small producer to have access to state-of-the-art humane slaughter facilities. And we could provide offline information about that.
Okay, let's go to another question. Let's see, from Melinda Hemmelgarn. We have, how and who tracks pesticide use in the U.S., and what percentage is agricultural versus home landscaping use?
So that's a very good question. The EPA is responsible for tracking pesticide use. I unfortunately am more attuned to the development of dose response and toxicity values for pesticide use, and I'm not certain if there are clear estimates out there that would compare home use to agricultural use, but I could give you my uninformed assumption that the agricultural pesticide use would likely overwhelm what you'd observe in terms of home usage. The issue is that the exposures incurred by humans would be very different in those two types of scenarios, and the risks posed by the temporality of the exposure would differ quite substantially. And I think an important point to make is that the agricultural pesticide use is likely to impact a wider range of folks. So the exposures incurred as a result of using pesticides in agricultural fields would impact humans who are responsible for actually applying the pesticides themselves, and anyone downwind or downstream of air or water that are impacted by the application of those pesticides. So independent of poundage of usage, for example, I think the exposed population would certainly be greater if one were to consider agricultural pesticide use.
Can I just add briefly to that, Keith? Here in the state of Maryland, another concern that we have about pesticide runoff is its impact on the ecosystem of the Chesapeake Bay. And I know that the Maryland Pesticide Network has demonstrated that we have just under 1 million acres of land in cultivation for crop production. We have about 1.1 million acres of land in turf. When you add up all the front lawns and back lawns of homes, all the grass in golf courses and municipal parks, and the amount of pesticide applied to turf in Maryland, not inside the home, but actually on the lawns in front and behind the houses, is significant, but it tends to be integrated with fertilizer in the various kinds of things that you see in bags at every store. So, Keith, you did a study once of so-called cock-a-doodle-doo pelletized chicken litter. What else goes on those nice green lawns that we see everywhere?
So that's a good point, Bob. So I conducted a study where we collected bags of pelletized poultry litter. So in response to dealing with the overwhelming volumes of poultry litter that are generated on Maryland's eastern shore, a pelletization plant has been built that accepts some relatively small fraction of the poultry waste generated on the shore annually, and they heat it up, crush it, and cool it into these pellet-shaped form that can be bagged and then sold in hardware stores and garden stores across the U.S. In an attempt to move the nutrients out of the Bay region. And because of the use of a drug called roxarsone, it's an arsenical growth promoter that's added to poultry feed, there is arsenic in poultry waste. And we had believed that we'd expect to see an increase in arsenic concentrations in the pelletized poultry waste relative to what you'd expect to see in the unpelletized poultry waste, because the pelletization process involves removing the water. So we thought by removing the water, but leaving everything else intact, you'd decrease the total mass, but you'd increase the concentration of arsenic. So we were surprised to find that the arsenic concentrations did not increase in the pellets, which would suggest that some of the arsenic is being lost in the waste stream from the facility. But what we did find is that there were concerning concentrations of arsenic in the pellets. Now what's interesting is that the pellets are marketed as organic. Now they're not USDA organic, because the USDA organic program does not regulate fertilizer products, but they are also being advertised as safe for children and pets, especially as compared to chemical fertilizers. So when people apply chemical fertilizers, it's typically advised that children and pets and adults not spend time on fertilized lawns because of potential chemical exposures. But the Cock-a-Doodle-Doo and some of the other pelletized poultry waste products say it's immediately safe for children and pets. And we estimated, based on the potential for a child to ingest a couple of pellets, and if you are a parent of young children, you'll know that this is certainly a possibility, the acute exposure to arsenic would be alarming and would likely induce some very serious gastrointestinal effects. So arsenic is unknowingly a part of a routine agricultural product that is advertised as organic.
Okay, I just wanted to hit a couple more people. I know we're going a little over, but Sabine von Mering had a question about behavior change. Given that the information about animal cruelty has been known for a long time, why do you think people continue to increase their consumption of chicken and meat? What are educators doing wrong about getting this information out to people? And she also cited a New York Times article saying that people don't eat more vegetables instead of meat because it's too much work. And this suggests that if we want to change eating habits, we have to change the way people actually divide their time. So do you have suggestions for how that kind of behavior change could be integrated into the Meatless Monday activities?
Well, it's a very good question about why we are not more alarmed by the horrible conditions under which animals live in industrial food animal production facilities. I think the main reason that there isn't greater concern is that it's also nicely sanitized. When the average American never sees the inside of a poultry shed or a hog barn. What they see are nicely wrapped, clean pieces of meat in the grocery counter. It used to be, when a larger proportion of the American population actually was involved directly in agriculture, that many, many people grew up knowing that the bird that was going to end up on the table for dinner had to be killed on the chopping block in the backyard, or the pig that maybe they had developed some feelings for over the year that it was growing was going to be slaughtered. And there was a real respect for the lives of animals and the way in which they were handled and slaughtered. That's now all been stripped away. None of us really have firsthand knowledge, so it's easier to deny that this is going on when we want to satisfy our desire for meat. I think a large part of the problem with the American diet is the fact that $14 billion per year is spent marketing fast food restaurants, sugared beverages, and candy, and a tiny, tiny fraction of that, less than a rounding error, is spent on social marketing about the benefits of a diet that's predominantly grains, fruits, and vegetables.
Okay, let's see. Let's try to hit one more question here. Let's see. So Ryan Andrews asks, on that count, what might be the most environmentally friendly meat to consume? If you had to pick.
That's a really challenging question. I think there are many reasons why it's difficult to give you an answer. I think the different animal production classes result in the contribution of different contaminants into the environment. They have similar but varied impacts on surrounding communities, many of those stemming from different animal waste procedures. So it's really challenging to pick one that's the safest or least environmentally damaging of all of them. I think we can speak, rather than to the type of animal or the type of meat you'd like to eat, and speak more directly to the methods of production. I think there are certain methods of production that are inherent to meats that are produced organically that are more environmentally sustainable. And I think there are, even outside of the USDA organic certification, there are production methods that are employed that are less damaging to the environment. An example of this would be grass-fed beef would certainly be a more environmentally sustainable choice than selecting beef that was produced at an industrial site.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Nachman and Dr. Lawrence, for your presentations. And we're going to send it back to Mike now just to wrap things up.
Thanks, Catherine. And let me just repeat that expression of gratitude to Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Nachman for their really stimulating discussion about what are the problems with the way we produce our food. And we're not going to solve it this afternoon, but hopefully we're going to take a bigger step towards solving it on Food Day. And I hope everybody on the call is going to be organizing activities on Food Day. There's some exciting things going in Los Angeles, Rhode Island, Arkansas, Iowa, Hawaii, at colleges and health departments, a whole range of things. So go to foodday.org, see a little bit about what's going on, and check out the coordinator's guide to get some suggestions on what you might be doing in your own community on the issues that are of greatest concern to you, be it pesticides or resource depletion, nutrition, food safety. It's all part of food and all part of Food Day. So thank you all for participating, and we'll keep you posted on the next Food Day webinar. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. We'll send out the link to the recording and the slides within a few days.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.